Welcome to the None But Curious podcast. We're all about finding inspiration in life's uncertainties. Whether you're still figuring things out, questioning your beliefs, or just curious about the world, come hang out with us as we celebrate the beauty of not having all the answers. There's a pattern that shows up in stories across continents and centuries. Before the breakthrough, there's a breakdown. Before the return, there's a descent. Before the light, there's a long stretch of dark. And if you become aware of this, you're going to see it everywhere. The hero doesn't just climb the mountain, they lose something precious. They wander, they grieve, they forget who they are. And only then, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, do they rise. Why? Why do so many cultures tell stories where loss, disorientation, and darkness come first? Why does renewal seem to require descent? I want us to sit with that pattern, not necessarily to solve it, but to explore what it might say about our own seasons of grief, burnout, and transformation. Because if you've ever felt like you were moving downward instead of forward, you are in very old company. Let's begin in ancient Sumer. The descent of Inanna is one of the oldest recorded myths in human history. It's more than 4,000 years old, and it begins with a decision. Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and power, decides to descend into the underworld. Her sister, Ereshkigal, rules there. The land of the dead is not a metaphor, it's a place of absolutely no return. Before she goes, Inanna instructs her servant, "If I do not come back in 3 days, seek help." Already, there's risk, and there's the possibility of loss. At the gates of the underworld, Inanna is stopped. The gatekeeper tells her she must remove one piece of clothing or jewelry at each of the 7 gates. Her crown, her necklace, her breastplate, her robe. At each gate, she is stripped. By the time she stands before Ereshkigal, she is naked and bowed low. And then something startling happens. She is judged, struck dead, and her body is hung on a hook. This is not a symbolic inconvenience. This is annihilation. For 3 days and 3 nights, she remains there. Eventually, help comes. Messengers are sent, a bargain is struck. Inanna is revived and allowed to ascend, but not without consequence. Someone has to take her place. The story is strange, stark, uncomfortable. But here's what stays with me. The descent required her to relinquish every symbol of status and identity. She could not enter the underworld as a queen. She could not negotiate from power, and she could not keep her armor. She had to be stripped down to something more essential. Descent stories often involve loss, not because cultures are obsessed with suffering. Or are they? No, it's because transformation seems to require disrobing. What if the downward movement isn't punishment? What if it's exposure? Now let's travel to ancient Greece. The myth of Orpheus and Eurydice begins with love. Eurydice dies from a snake bite. Orpheus is devastated. His grief is so profound that he does the unthinkable. He travels to the underworld to bring her back. With his lyre, he plays music so beautiful that it softens Hades and Persephone themselves. They agree to let Eurydice return with him on one condition. He must walk ahead of her. He must not look back. Not until they have fully reached the upper world. Such a simple rule, right? And yet, as they get closer to the exit, doubt creeps in. Is she really there? Was this a trick? Has he been fooled? He turns around, and for a moment he sees her, and then she vanishes. Lost again. Unlike Inanna, Orpheus does not successfully bring someone back. His descent ends in irreversible loss. So why tell this story? Perhaps because descent is not always triumphant. Sometimes grief doesn't resolve neatly. Sometimes love does not undo death. And sometimes we look back. There's something profoundly honest in this myth because it acknowledges that in the darkness, trust is fragile, faith wavers, the mind plays tricks. When you're in the underworld of grief or burnout, certainty dissolves. You second guess everything, and you doubt what you cannot see. Orpheus's mistake isn't weakness, it's just longing. And longing in the dark can make us turn too soon. This myth doesn't promise that every descent ends in visible restoration, but it does affirm something important. Grief is powerful enough to move us into depths we never imagined we could survive. Now we're going to move on to Siberian and Mongolian shamanic practices. And in these traditions, spiritual initiation involves a visionary descent. During this initiation, the shaman may experience their own dismemberment, whether symbolically or in dreams. Their body is taken apart, their bones are counted, their organs examined. Sometimes they're even boiled or burned in the vision. It sounds violent, and in a way, it really is. But this dismemberment is not destruction, it's preparation. After being taken apart, the shaman is reassembled, sometimes with new bones of iron, sometimes with added strength. They emerge with the ability to travel between worlds, to descend into spiritual realms and return with healing. The descent is not optional, it's the path. And here's what's fascinating. In these traditions, suffering isn't evidence of failure, it's initiation. The one who has gone down and come back is uniquely qualified to guide others because they know the terrain. They've been dismantled. And they're not speaking theoretically about darkness, they have lived it. This reframes descent in a powerful way. What if the downward season isn't the end of your usefulness, but the beginning of your depth? So, why do so many stories go down before they rise? Maybe because nature does. Seeds are buried before they sprout. Winter precedes spring. The moon wanes before it waxes. Even the sun appears to descend each evening. Cultures watching the natural world would have noticed this rhythm. Loss is followed by return, but not without interval. There is always a middle, an in between. And in that in between, things look bleak. When you're in grief, it doesn't feel like a mythic arc, it feels like disorientation. When you're burned out, it doesn't feel like initiation, it feels like depletion. And when you're depressed, it does not feel symbolic in any way, it just feels heavy. But myths offer a wider frame. They suggest that downward movement may be part of a pattern older than your individual story. That doesn't minimize the pain, but it does contextualize it. So let's consider grief, because it is a sort of underworld. You move through days half lit, sounds are muted, colors shift. You're stripped, like Inanna, of certain illusions about permanence and control. You're asked not to look back too soon, like Orpheus, because the ache of longing can pull you under again. And you may feel dismantled like the shaman, taken apart by loss and unsure if you will ever be reassembled. Descent myths don't romanticize this. Inanna dies. Orpheus fails. The shaman is torn apart. The stories acknowledge the cost, but they also insist on something radical. The descent is not meaningless. Let's consider burnout, because that's another form of descent. You lose the crown of competence, the necklace of identity, the breastplate of productivity. You can't keep performing at the same level. The old pace just doesn't fit. And it can be humiliating, like standing at the gate and being asked to remove everything that once defined you. But what if burnout is a gatekeeper, not punishing you, but protecting you? You cannot enter the next phase carrying all the old expectations. Something has to be surrendered. We often imagine growth as an upward arrow. More clarity, more success, more strength. But these myths suggest something different. Transformation often begins with subtraction. Before you gain wisdom, you lose certainty. Before you gain compassion, you lose naivety. And before you gain depth, you lose simplicity. The downward phase feels like regression, but it might actually be reconfiguration. Like the shaman's bones being replaced with iron, something unseen may be strengthening beneath the surface. I think so many cultures told these stories because they understood something we sometimes forget. Life includes collapse. Empires fall. Bodies age. Relationships end. Dreams shift. To tell only stories of triumph would be dishonest, but to tell stories where descent is part of the arc, that offers us companionship. It says, you're not the first to go down, and you're likely not going to be ruined by it. So, what might this entire pattern say about us? That we need spaces where falling apart is not shameful. That grief is part of life, not an interruption. And maybe that when nothing feels stable, we're standing at a gate. Inanna didn't descend by accident. Orpheus descended because he loved, and the shaman descended to heal. So we find that descent often follows devotion, and caring deeply opened you to loss. Striving intensely opened you to burnout. You seek meaning, and that opens you to disorientation. The very qualities that make you alive also make you very vulnerable to the underworld. And when these figures rise, they are not exactly who they were before. Inanna returns changed. Orpheus, though he loses Eurydice, becomes a symbol of tragic devotion. And the shaman emerges marked by their journey. Rising doesn't mean returning to who you were. How can you? It means carrying what you've seen and experienced and letting that shape who you become. If you feel like your life is moving downward right now, whether into grief, into uncertainty, into a quiet kind of collapse, you're participating in a pattern humans have been navigating for thousands of years. And that doesn't make it easy, but it also may mean that it's not random. You may be shedding something that can't come with you. You may be learning the terrain of darkness so you can recognize it later in someone else. You may be in the hallway between worlds. And hallways are not destinations. They are passages. And I don't think the question is how to get out faster, but rather how to stay present long enough to notice what this space is asking of you. What is loosening? What no longer fits? What is quietly waiting to take shape? Because passages slowly change you while you're moving through them. And then one day, without a clear dividing line, you're going to look around and realize you're not in the hallway anymore. Thank you for joining me today. If this episode resonates, please feel free to share it with a friend, subscribe to None But Curious, and visit the website if you like at nonebutcurious.org. Or just simply join me for the next one. I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that you keep returning. Stay curious.